It's absurd how many times you rewrite a paper. It's one of those things I never understood about science until I actually did it, where you're writing a paper and you'll change like one little thing here and you don't realize the amount of other dependencies it has throughout the paper. So you will change like one bit of the results, then that changes the discussion, so that changes like the initial framing you had in the introduction. It's so hard to conceptualize that as you're doing the work, because it's a process of you like creating that story and you're constantly tweaking it on the fly. That draft one, where it finally feels like you've got the story and like all your ideas have crystallized, that feels very fulfilling. It's not easy, but it's fulfilling. The draft 9 that you do about 4 or 5 months later is pain. It's just pure pain. What I've almost realized is that rewriting is what science is. It's that entire process of shaping and reshaping your story. It's why science is malleable, and that's why the title of this video is what it is. It took me so long to realize that, because I thought it was clean. When I first came into doing my PhD, I really thought the process was linear, that you would do the introduction, you'd write the methods, write your results, and then write your discussion, that kind of step-by-step process. And then I started doing science. It's more like you do the results and you're tweaking those, and then you get to the discussion, and then you kind of fill in from the back forward, intro, methods, whatever. And then I realized after doing more projects that there's no real process to this at all. You can start from any point in that journey. You could do like a very big literature review. You can go straight to the coding and straight to the results, straight to the experiments in the lab. You could have a hypothesis, but naturally that's going to get changed and reshaped as you're going through that process. Everything is constantly in flux, and you're hoping to find that one through line that's sturdy. That gap between the story that we put out at the end versus the actual process required to get there is what the gist of this video is about, because I don't really feel like we ever fully describe how messy the process of actually doing scientific research is. The challenge is that we're trying to publish papers in journals a lot of the time, and that requires you to fit within the theme of that journal, within the word count of that journal, and that compression from your initial story that could be 50 pages into that 10-12 page story that the journal wants is going to naturally lose out on a lot of nuance. And so you had all these things, all these experiments that you've run, some that support your final story, some that don't, and all of them contribute to the nuanced picture of that story. But when it comes to actual journal publishing time, what you do is, I'm just going to take the things that support it and put it in here, and all the negative results, if I include them at all, will go in the supplementary. That's not good science at all. And I've tried my best to include all the negative results in work I've done and try and include that at least in the story about the limitations and whatever. That's good, right? But it still doesn't capture the nuance that we want, and it doesn't reflect how brittle that story making is. And so a lot of that raises this pretty obvious question of like, when is your scientific story actually finished? The only answer that I've come to really is that it never truly is. And you pick some, not arbitrary point, some kind of resource constraint point, like the resources you have available to you, your supervisor's expertise, your expertise, the data you have, how much money you have, the other collaborators you have, to kind of all create this story as best as you can within the time frame you allot to it, and then you put it out. And I think it should really be the aim of all scientists to try and explain as much nuance as you can within that story. I saw a thread recently on Twitter from Prachya Vasti, who's the Chief Scientific Officer of Arcadia Science in America. It's one of these new scientific organizations, and they self-publish a lot of their own research. She was talking about how this kind of finishing point in science is so arbitrary in that it's set by journal editorial standards and not by the actual scientists themselves, which is naturally going to lose information in a discipline that needs to be very precise about how it describes things. Her suggestion for that was to include all the metadata, all the context that we can in the outputs of the paper, of the code base, whatever you put out, to ensure that that context is as reproducible as possible. And in that way, you treat the actual paper that you submit to the journal as more of a snapshot in time of your research rather than the finished product. I saw an amazing little addition to this entire system from a journal called Digital Discovery, and it was about creating paper commits. If you're not familiar with commit from coding terminology, it's essentially like a formal update to whatever you're working on. I've finished some code, I've updated some code, let me write a commit and then push this to the main server so other people can see the changes that I've made. Essentially, it's the history of whatever you've been doing. And what Digital Discovery did by introducing this commit is that they said, we accept that this paper you've given to us won't necessarily be the end product. And so if things come out that change that story, you can add this commit in, you can update the paper. And I think that's a really cool way of doing science. I think that's what we should be progressing to, like adding these little bits of complexity here and there to make sure that we get to more of that nuance. And there's much bigger potential here, I see, in the form of agentic science to help standardize that entire process. And what do I mean by that specifically? A lot of AI research looks at developing models, but where I think the benefit of agents come in is that now you can start to think more concretely in terms of workflows of science. A workflow is really explicit about the steps of the process, how they interact with each other, what the inputs and outputs are at each step. Like, that's what we need to be building towards in science. If you can put out a workflow for other people to follow, that drastically improves the level of standardization you can provide for science. If a lot of that brittleness in the scientific story comes from stripping out little bits of the story in order to make it palatable to a journal audience, what the workflow provides is the context itself, right? The workflow encodes all the steps taken to actually create the output in the first place. And if instead you can put that process out directly, then other people can directly replicate it. I'm under no illusion of like, we're gonna just solve science because we can now get workflows in. But I think it's a big enough step that it's not just incremental to be thinking in terms of science like this. I'm not at all advocating for the complete removal of papers at all. Like, papers serve an important purpose. The snapshot is still important, right? It doesn't tell the entire story, but it tells enough to be workable and to be actionable for future scientists to build on. We have monkey brains that respond well to stories. That's why storytelling has been an art since back in Neanderthal caveman age up until now, and will only become more of a thing as we get these kind of hollowed out stories from whatever AI chatbot you're using. The nice thing about all these little things like version history and the commits and like thinking in terms of snapshots is they're still understandable to humans, right? And the workflow, especially one that can be represented as a diagram, you know, this step and then this step and then this step, that's also very understandable to humans. Arguably, it's even more understandable. And that's why I think it's not just an incremental improvement, it's kind of a stepwise improvement. And if this is done across the board by a lot of scientists, you end up hopefully getting to a stage where we don't deal with as big a reproducibility crisis as we deal with now. It's a big part as well of why making science content is so hard. Like, I've struggled with trying to show all the processes of it, because I started trying to make content when I still thought that it was this linear process, and then you actually start doing it and you realize how messy it is, that it's so hard to put the entire process out onto a YouTube video, which naturally has to be simpler, much simpler than a paper or even a blog post. But all these little ways of us adding nuance, right? Like showing all those behind the scenes, you know, the dead ends that you go to, how the hypothesis changes, the stuff that did and didn't work. The aim of that isn't just to be more honest, but the other scientists can learn from that and build off of it, that the general public could look at this and be like, oh, okay, they made this story, but then there was some nuance here as to why that wasn't necessarily all the way true, or why the assumptions they made only held for this specific use case and not for everything generally. And paradoxically, getting to more of that messiness actually leads us to creating stronger science and hopefully stronger scientific institutions that not only just help scientists, but help the public have more faith in science as well. And that's what I'm trying to do with this channel, at least. So yeah, thank you for watching. Appreciate it. Until next time.